Okay, so today we're going to talk about levels. So if you can't get a good mix using levels, either you have some really bad tracks, badly recorded or bad input or something like that, or you just can't quite hear things properly. You're not going to get a fabulous mix using levels, but you should be able to get an okay one most of the time. Again, depends on your source tracks. So when we're talking about levels, we're talking about volume, obviously. But volume's kind of a tricky issue when it comes to mixing. A seasoned engineer can hear about 1/10 of a decibel difference when they're adjusting stuff. Should be able to hear that. The problem is that 1/10 of a decibel difference in volume is enough to make most people, including experienced engineers, think that something sounds better when in fact it just sounds louder. That's a really problematic thing when it comes to mixing, because a lot of the time you'll be boosting stuff and you think, oh, that sounds better. But when you actually match it up in terms of subjective volume to what it was before, you may find that, oh, actually it sounds worse, or it actually sounds worse in the overall mix. So in general, you should be trying to adjust for lowering stuff rather than raising stuff. When you're raising stuff, it tends to end up in a kind of competitive war, particularly when you've got that first initial mix stage where you've got all the tracks there and you're just trying to get the right levels. You pump up this thing, and then that's too loud, so you pump up this thing. It's kind of a rock band scenario, you know. The drummer plays louder, so the guitarist plays louder, and then the bassist can't hear himself, and blah, 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 blah. So, generally speaking, when it comes to volume, you want to be cutting rather than increasing where you can. The more experience you get with this, the easier it is to figure this stuff out. So it's not a big deal. The second thing that you need to know about is our brain hears different frequencies at different volumes differently. So you can look up the Fletcher-Munson curve, which is also tends to be called the loudness curve. Older stereos would have a button on them which was loudness, and all that did was it bumped up the lower frequencies and the higher frequencies so that when you were listening to something at a lower level it sounded more or less right. And you turn that off when you turn the stereo up because your ears adjust, obviously. So that's a factor in volume. The other factor is that particularly when you're adjusting EQs and stuff like that, as I said, it's very easy to fool yourself with small levels of volume. That's why with a lot of plug-in manufacturers, their built-in presets will be quite significantly louder than the incoming signal, and some of them are particularly bad for that. I won't name any of them. Steve Slate. But, you know, some of them really do raise the outgoing signal up by like a decibel or a decibel and a half, and that's obviously very misleading. If you put your signal in there and all of a sudden it's coming out significantly louder than it was before, it's very difficult to tell whether or not the processing that you're doing is actually helping or harming. One of the methods for getting around that is what you'd call A-weighted volume matching, which some plugins have. For example, Steve Slate's FGX plugin. And that's really useful because basically it takes the frequency response of our ears and it takes the incoming signal, it figures out what the rough subjective volume is, and then it takes the outgoing signal and it figures out what the rough subjective volume is, and it matches those two subjective volumes. And what that means is when you're adjusting stuff in a plugin that has A-weighted volume matching, what you're getting out when you're adjusting things around should more or less be able to tell you whether or not what you've got is sounding better or whether it's just sounding louder. But if you don't have a plugin which does that, you can also do it by, for example, keeping one hand on the volume knob on your stereo and adjusting things with a slider in your other hand with the mouse. That's often what I end up doing for mastering, particularly when you're adjusting sort of the limiter or the loudness maximizer, whatever you want to call it. It's very easy to fool yourself that something sounds better when you go drag, oh, it's louder, it must be better. No. If you adjust your volume at the same time while you're dragging that slider, you may find that beyond a certain level, it's actually starting to sound a little bit more just kind of flat and bland as a mix, or everything's just starting to sound a little bit too unfocused or whatever. So bearing in mind the volume response, just use that and keep that in the back of your head while you're mixing. So the third thing to talk about with volumes is gain staging. So most plugins are set up for either mixing or mastering. If they're set up for mastering, the volume level that they expect coming in is going to be considerably louder than the volume level they expect coming in if it was a mix, an individual track in a mix, I should say. But most plugins are calibrated to sound their best when the signal coming in is on average about -18 decibels and its peaks are at around about -12 decibels. So that's something that you want to bear in mind as you're going through your mix. When you've got something coming out reasonably loud out of one plugin, you may want to adjust the volume afterwards before it goes into the next one. This is particularly important for anything that deals with volume, for example, EQs, compressors, limiters, this sort of thing. You kind of need to be careful around that, because if you don't do your gain staging, then you can end up with mixes that sound very flat, very just kind of big balls of sound with no dynamics, or just kind of plain bad. The reason why that is beyond the scope of this talk, but it's kind of set up to match the rough values of what we had on outboard equipment. Of course, digital meters and digital measures are different from analog measures, but that's the way it is. So, on the other hand, if you're dealing with a mastering plugin, then generally speaking it's going to be set up to expect a much higher volume level coming into it. So that's different again. When you start a mix, really what you should be doing is just getting everything, getting it in mono, and then adjusting the levels. After you've got something that's reasonably, just sounds sort of balanced without having to do too much more to it, then you can start playing around with EQ, stereo, that sort of thing. But volume always comes first.